This is Creating a Family. Talk about foster, adoptive, and kinship care. I want to say welcome back to our regulars. We truly appreciate you. And I also want to do a special shout out welcome to our newbies. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you find value here. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show, as well as the director of the nonprofit, creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking with two former foster youth, and we're going to hear their stories of healing, sexual abuse, trauma, and foster care. Our guests today are Lanitta Berry. She was a pregnant and parenting teen growing up in the North Carolina foster care system. In May of 2020, she joined the 2% population of former foster youth that graduate from post-secondary education. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in business administration and finance. She has always had a passion for changing the system, which allows her the unique opportunity to collaborate with stakeholders on all three levels of government, as well as being part of many grassroots organizations, movements, and the nonprofit spaces. We also have Mayia Warren. Mayia entered DSS, that's Department of Social Services, Custody and Foster Care, in December 2010. She was later adopted and raised by her grandmother, yet still navigates and is navigating a myriad of challenges that come with childhood trauma. She has multiple invisible disabilities, albinism, and is visually impaired. In the spring of 2021, Mayia also graduated, and she graduated from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro with a bachelor's degree in kinesiology. Today, Mayia is an advocate in multiple fields such as disability, foster care, children and families, and wellness. She is also an independent recording artist, poet, author, and philanthropist who has dedicated her life to creative and impactful service. And she has an album dropping. And at the end, make sure you stay to the end because I'm going to play a snippet from Maya's album just to give you a taste. All right. So welcome, Mayia and Lanitta, to this podcast, the Creating a Family podcast. We really believe that we as foster, adoptive, and kinship parents need to learn from people like you, because you are the ones that we are attempting to serve, not you now because you're out of the system and grown up, but those who follow you, and you are the ones who can teach us best, the people who have the lived experience. I think it would help if we start, if you could give us maybe a Cliff Note version, the synopsis of your life's story. That's daunting for anybody to do, but in particular, as it relates to how you entered care, why you entered care, your experience in care, that type of stuff. So Mayia, let's start with you. Tell us all about your life, okay?
Yeah, I'm going to try to summarize it as best as I can. I was born in 1997 and born with most of my disabilities. And unfortunately, I did not necessarily have the best home life as a result, of my parents. And so they were both physically and psychologically abusive. And the irony of it, for those who can't see because of the audio, is I have a condition called oculocutaneous albinism, which means I'm a Black female with no pigmentation in my eyes, hair, and skin. And that's where my vision impairment comes from. And one of my earliest memories in elementary school, my parents showed up to pick me up. And one of the girls in my class was like, she looked at me and then she looked at my parents who had more melanin than I did. And she was like, "Are you adopted?" And I was like, "No, I'm not adopted." So put a pin in that to continue to experience a lot of things that I navigated. In 2010, my biological mom passed away from brain cancer that originally started out as breast cancer. Then she went into remission. And then all of a sudden, she ended up in stage 4 brain cancer. And it was pretty much downhill very rapidly from there. And so from that point on, we navigated hospice care until she passed. And then after she passed, my biological father kind of continued to spiral mentally, which resulted in me being sexually abused, not just once, but on multiple occasions between almost her funeral date, to be exact, until December of 2010. And the interesting thing about my story is because he kind of fell into almost like this psychosis where he believed that people were tracking him. And so he felt very suspicious of his surroundings. So we would be traveling and kind of very nomadic for a while. And we ended up in, I think it's Huntsville, North Carolina, for some reason. And we were in the hotel and he had just got finished abusing me. And then the next morning he woke up and he was like, I think I need to call the police on myself.
Huh.
And so he called the police on himself, and the police officers came to the hotel where we were staying and they were questioning him. And then another officer was questioning myself and my younger brother. And they asked, hey, do you know the phone number of any relatives or anybody that you can reach out to come get you guys? And mind you, they weren't aware of how we were being abused. They just know this person called the police on himself and he had kids with him. So I remembered my grandmother's phone number and I gave it to them. And then within a couple of hours, her and my aunt showed up. From that point on, that's like when I ended up in Department of Social Services custody. And then within a matter of a couple of months, like my body started feeling really off and weird. Like I was tired all the time. And so I was having like my annual checkup in like January of 2011. And my pediatrician noticed that there were some physical attributes that I was exhibiting that was aligned with pregnancy. So she calls in my grandmother and like she shows whatever she showed to my grandmother, and my grandmother just starts bawling.
Hmm. How old were you then, Maya?
I had just turned 13 as of December 2010. So the pediatrician, I just remember her, like, I didn't even know doctors at this time had like their own office, but she ushers me and my grandmother to the office and she's like, I need you to understand the seriousness of the questions that I'm about to ask you. And so she's asking me different questions about details. And to the best of my ability, I answered them. And then from that point on, visitation with my father was canceled at that point. There was a whole chain of events where a lot of decisions were made in such a swift period of time. And the next thing I know, I was being whisked away to Atlanta, Georgia to have an abortion. And for me, I think that's a period of time where I kind of blacked out almost because I'm a minor and a lot of decisions were being made on my behalf in my best interest, but there wasn't a lot of say so or wherewithal on my end. So I'm just experiencing all of this.
Hmm.
And as you can imagine, like seeing the looks on adults' faces in response to having to deal with something so traumatic with a 13-year-old girl.
Hmm.
And so after the procedure had taken place, it was pretty much around sixth/seventh grade. And I kind of got there's a whole train of events around that period of time. And eventually that went a 3 year or so period. And the adoption process went through with my grandmother. We were able to get our names changed. And that's pretty much the extent of how I ended up in there and how I got adopted and some of the brief pitfalls with it.
Okay, and we'll go into more details later. Thank you. Lanitta, can you share a synopsis as well of how you came into foster care and then your experience after you were in?
Yeah, I'll try to sum things up. I guess before I went into foster care, I will say I had a somewhat normal life. I mean, I grew up in a two-parent home, and at that time, I knew that was something to be grateful of because a lot of my peers, a lot of my friends, they didn't grow up in two-parent homes. And I remember just being a kid and knowing the importance and the great family aspects of having a Sunday dinner, having a home cooked meal that was prepared by your parents and all that great stuff. I had siblings. Many of my siblings are quite older than me. I am technically the only child between my father and my mother, but I do have other siblings from my parents. Yeah, life was normal, but maybe around the age of 9, that's when I started to notice some notable changes. My mom started getting sick a lot, and we found out that she had uterine fibroid cancer, and it was in the 4th stage. So, Maya, I just want to say I really truly empathize with you because in 2010, my mom passed away. She actually passed away literally a month after my birthday.
Wow.
She passed away in May.
How old were you?
I turned 10. I turned 10 in April, And in May, she passed away. That was very traumatic for me, as well as a little bit before her passing, my brother went into the foster care system. And at the time, being a little child, I didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. I knew that at that time, my dad was disabled, and there was just a lot that we needed to do as a family to make sure that my mother was comfortable. Like, I remember us getting rid of all of our furniture just to accommodate her hospital bed, all of the machines that she needed, which my dad did some things, but it was my brother too. It took a toll on my brother. And eventually he tried to commit suicide. And I was the person who found him. I found him. And later after that, we found out that he tried to overdose on my mother's morphine. And that led to him being in foster care. But in 2010, my mother passed away. And by that time, my brother was out. He was in foster care. So it was just my dad and I. And that's when I started to really get a more understanding of why my life ended up the way it was, why circumstances happened, because now I started getting abused. I started experiencing the verbal abuse, the physical abuse, the neglect, and it was definitely a lot. So from the ages of 10 to 12, I endured a lot. And there was so many things that I had to really, truly deal with. I had to deal with the fact that I literally had a great family in my eyes, and it shrunk down to only 2 people in the home. I had to deal with the fact that I don't know whether or not I deserve this punishment. It was just a lot. And part of my trauma that I had to really battle with is remembering the words that my dad said when my mom passed away, and that it was my fault.
Oh, no.
And the reason why he said that is because my mom, she passed away from uterine fibroid cancer. And that came from when she got pregnant with me. She actually had the IUD in her, which I'll mention this because this actually impacts me later on in life. She had the IUD in her, as well as she was older. So the doctors literally said before my parents got married, Miss Berry, you're not you're not getting pregnant again. Like, you're too old. Like, it's okay. So she ended up getting uterine fibroids. She had me. The doctors, I believe at the time, found them, and I think they did something to make sure that it wouldn't be an issue. But 10 years down the line, it became an issue. It became cancerous. And my dad blamed that on me. So, yeah, I had to emotionally cope with so many things. And before I actually went into care, I got pregnant with my daughter. And there was a lot of things that I did as a child. But one thing I do remember, the things that I did do, in a way, it was like a cry for help. It felt like I was in a bubble, and I didn't know if I needed to stay put or if I needed to let the bubble bust.
Lanitta, let me ask you a question. Was your pregnancy the result of abuse, or was it not?
No, it wasn't the result of abuse, and I'm truly grateful for that. But just even when I did get pregnant, at that time I was 12, and one of the reasons why I had to go into care is because none of my local doctor's offices would take me. They said, we don't have liability. Like, we just simply cannot take you.
Oh, no.
I think oftentimes that doesn't get talked about when we talk about advocacy and system change efforts, about how, yes, there could be abuse. Yes, there's sometimes neglect and many different other reasons, but also there are times where our local communities are unable to support youth. And that's a reason why it kind of reinforces them going into care in the first place. And for me, that definitely was the case. And I had to transition into a kinship care setting. Then eventually I went into foster care. My very first placement was Cretanton of North Carolina. And Cretanton has a great legacy. It's a nonprofit organization that allows pregnant and parenting. Well, they have 3 different programs, I should say. There's the maternity program. If you are a birthing person who needs shelter, needs food, you can go into the program and you are able to stay up until you have your baby. Then there's the legacy program. It's specific for if you are in foster care and you're in the transitional age range of 18 to 21, you can be a part of that program until you age out of the program. And the last program is the Sarah's House program. That is specific for young people who had their babies. They're in foster care. And I believe the age out age is 21 as well. So I was able to go into maternity and I did transition from that placement, from that congregate care placement to a foster home. But I think we can talk more about that as we proceed on. But yeah, that's a snippet.
That's a snippet. So when you transitioned into a foster home, you had is it your daughter?
Yes. And I do want to talk about that experience too, because that's another thing that we don't really talk about.
What is that?
When a young person gives birth, when they're in child welfare, when they're in foster care. So I had my baby. Um, very interesting. I live in Charlotte. I'm from Charlotte. I had my baby during the winter storm of 2014. So after I had my child, you give birth. Typically, you stay a few days. I was induced. So the doctors were paying an extra eye on me, making sure that I'm okay. My child was okay. But right when I was getting ready to leave the hospital, I was denied me taking my child with me.
Why? Because of your age?
It wasn't just because of my age. It was because, and I didn't find out this then. I actually found out about this later on, why this happens. It's actually a common practice. North Carolina is not the only place that does it. It's very common throughout the United States. But oftentimes when a young person gives birth, there has to be some legality paperwork drawn up to figure out who has custody of the baby, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if the young person is in care. Oftentimes, if you're just a normal person, you're not in foster care, it's very easy to understand who has legal custody of the child, right? But because I was in foster care, legality speaking, we need to know who is going to make sure that this baby is okay.
Mm-hmm.
I was a young person, so clearly I didn't have custody. And the reason why I had to be separated from my child is because of that. So paperwork was drawn up, and I remember it was hours and hours. And like I said, it was during a winter storm, as well as I was breastfeeding too. So now I don't necessarily say I have separation anxiety, but I'm coping with all of that because all of that hit me as a 12-year-old child. And it was definitely a lot on me.
Sure. Eventually, when you left the hospital, were you placed with your daughter into a foster home that was taking care of both of you? Because you were still a child as well.
Absolutely. So at that time, it was February, and we stayed at Cretanton up until, I want to say, May of 2014. And from then on, we went into our very first therapeutic foster home, which was amazing for many reasons. I really felt like I had a sense of belonging in that home. My foster mom, we were both learning from each other together. It was my first foster home. I was her first young person, as well as my child was with me. So we were really learning together, and she taught me so many things. She allowed me to really kind of see life after foster care, even though I was still in it. Like, I was able to do a lot of things that made me feel normal, that made my situation feel normal, which, if you are a young person experiencing that, that in itself can weigh on you.
Can you give us some specific examples of what you mean by she was able to allow you to feel normal or have a normal adolescence?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that she would definitely expose me to, something that I was actually used to at one point in time, that was the family dinners. Like, there were family trips, family vacations, all that great stuff, as well as traveling. I really felt like I was just sheltered when I was with my dad, but being with her, she, showed me so many great places. Oftentimes we would talk about what I wanted to do in the future, and I would tell her my plans. And one of the things that I said that I was really passionate in, which eventually it did change, was accounting. So when I was in high school, like for the summers and stuff like that, I would go to accounting camps. If ever I needed anything for my education, all I had to do was ask. Like, it was a lot of stuff. Even if I wanted to, like, hang out with friends, if I communicated that, there were opportunities to do that.
And I would assume that she allowed you to parent your daughter, but she supported you and helped you, which would also allow you to experience, or at least some of the opportunities of adolescence. Is that correct? I mean, she helped you with the parenting, but allowed you to parent.
Yes. So I will say how the system also acknowledges a parenting pregnant situation of, you have the parent that's actually still a child, and then you have a child.
Right, right. It's complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. And oftentimes they group them up in what is called like a sibling pair, right? Which is very interesting. And even though I was able to still parent and things of that nature, at times it was difficult. It just was, especially as I got older, as I transitioned out of the system and I had to be recognized as a birth parent fighting to get my child back. It was just a lot. And again, I keep on saying this. We don't talk about this enough, but truly, we really do not have conversations on how impactful just fighting to get your child back, especially when you're working with the same people. You were just considered as a young person, and now you're fighting to get your child back. We don't have these conversations enough.
Yeah.
And just that situation alone, it was very emotional. I had to prove consistently, and I get that. I understand that, right? But there were times where it felt very political. And I'm not saying that my foster mom, like, I was having issues with her. She was great, right? But it's just the system. The system will literally put you in uncomfortable situations. And now looking back on it, I felt like at times that was very unnecessary.
That they were against you. Mayia, I want to come back to you. Lanitta has just shared some of the good parts of what she experienced in her foster home. You went, I think, immediately into kinship care, but your grandmother became a foster parent to you. From your standpoint as a child being raised in a kinship environment, what were some of the better parts of having been taken in by kin versus a non-kin foster home? And then if you could contrast that with some of the challenges.
Yeah, so I think I had the benefit. One, I always had an affinity for people who were older than me. I relate very well to people who are, like, most of my friends are decades older than me. And I think being raised by someone who's had a lot of life experience, you kind of almost become tethered to other things that maybe other people in your age group aren't aware of. Like I grew up on cassette tapes and VHS and, the Disney Vault collection of VHS and things like that. So I'm very much an old soul. So that's one of the benefits. And my great grandmother is still alive, who is my grandmother's mother. So like I have the benefit of experientially being around people who have more life experience than me. In contrast, though, you're not really on either side, like the grandparent and the child. Neither one of you are prepared for the duality that situation places on you.
What do you mean by that, the duality?
Yeah, so you go from where you were just the grandparent who could pop in, when need be, do whatever you need to do, and then go back to your home, and you didn't have to step in that parenting role.
Mm-hmm.
Then you transition to having to be a grandparent and a parent. And those two things often kind of coincide. And I think a lot of the stuff, looking back, that I see in my family line is generational trauma. So when you have someone who has a heart for children, but they haven't processed a lot of their own things, it can cause a lot of issues in how you internalize that as a child. So you start taking on that, the way that they cope with their own stresses, their inability to regulate their emotions and things like that. So in many ways, though it was, I think, by design and me being able to stay with my grandmother, unfortunately, a lot of the trauma I experienced previously was kind of further perpetuated. And even as I unpack my own story, it's kind of like you kind of have to have a perspective of navigating the truth, right? Which the truth in my life story comes with joy and sorrow coexisting. So while I'm glad it was a kinship placement, I still dealt with a lot of things emotionally that my grandmother necessarily wasn't prepared to handle. None of us were prepared to handle it. And then you tack that on to feeling unsupported as a foster parent and the stresses that come with that, because she herself was on fixed income, and never mind the dynamic of my brother and I, because he's younger than me. So I pretty much raised him for most of our lives until we came into DSS custody and kinship placement. So there was a lot of dynamics that it took me years to unlearn. One, that I didn't have to be my brother's parent anymore. It took me a lot of dynamics to be able to dissociate, oh, my grandmother is responding this way, not necessarily because of me, but it feels like it's because of me. And I'm taking this personally, and then understanding, like, why am I taking that personally? And I was in therapy for over 10 years. Like, actually, my last therapy session was last year.
Probably why you are as put together as you are, because it sounds like you've processed a lot of it, or in the process of processing it.
The irony, though, is I did most of my processing through my faith, because my faith in Jesus Christ is what really has kept me tethered and sane. And even when I look at my own story, I'm like, there's no logical reason why I should be able to articulate what I'm articulating after all that I have been through. And so therapy kind of served as a reservoir for all the conversations that I was having with God that I wasn't able to have with family. And the amalgamation of that, I was able to process that. But at some point, looking back now, I realized therapy served as a placeholder for the community and support system that I did not have. And now that I have that support system and growing community, I don't necessarily need therapy anymore. And that's just my story, because I recognize, like, the things that I needed someone to listen. I needed someone to hear me. I needed someone to provide insight, accountability, like all those things that a lot of people go to therapy for. Like, a lot of us are just lonely, and a lot of people aren't equipped to necessarily be a friend or be someone who can be that involved. And so I think in many ways, community in this stage of my life has really kind of helped further round things out.
And was therapy provided through the child welfare department because you were in foster care?
Yeah. So I started out with one therapist, and I don't even remember this person's name. I just remember they needed to get footage in this therapy session for the court hearing. So there was like a camera set up in front of me, and there was like a large TV to like the right of me. And they were like, now we know this is going to be hard, but we need you to like provide details about what you experienced and all that. So as you can imagine, that was like reliving it 100 times over, plus the nightmares.
Plus being in front of a camera. Plus being 13 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot. So I'm recounting this stuff. And I think between the chemistry of that moment, they figured out this therapist probably isn't the best one for her. And so I remembered a therapist that my brother was going to back when we were with our parents for ADHD. And for some reason, I remembered her name. And that ended up being the therapist that I was with for a while. But even in that, like, I think it started out as being covered by the welfare system. And then I started getting SSI because I was denied SSDI multiple times because I hadn't yet paid into the system. And with SSI and having survivor benefits, which is how I was able to get SSI, that came with the Medicare and the Medicaid because I also am disabled.
Can you define SSI and SSDI for the audience?
Yeah, so Social Security income versus Social Security disability income.
Right.
And the main difference between the two is like you have to have a certain amount of work experience having paid into the system over a period of time in terms of employment to receive Social Security disability income. And no one told me why I received the benefits. It wasn't until last year I had to do some digging to get clarity, because when you don't have clarity about why you're getting what you're getting, you also don't have clarity about the lines or the boundaries that if you cross those, you lose your benefits, which creates a lot of fear and uncertainty on top of dealing with what you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. It's real. And if you don't know why you're getting what you're getting, you also don't know what else may be available that could help. I am loving this interview. I am learning a lot from this interview, so I do hate to interrupt, but I want to ask a favor of you. If you are listening to this podcast, and especially this one, and hopefully you're enjoying it as much as me, do us a favor and please tell a friend about the creatingafamily.org podcast. That is how people find out about podcasts, especially if you don't have the major bucks to advertise on other podcasts, which is extremely expensive. We're a nonprofit. We don't have the money to throw at advertising in that way. So we have to depend on people like you who are listening and enjoying. So please spread the word. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell anyone in the foster, adoptive, or kinship community about this podcast. And thank you. And now back to this great interview. All right, Lanitta, coming back to you, you shared some of the better parts of when you were placed in foster care. It was, you had normal, I'm using air quotes here, experiences and a more typical adolescence. Were you in the same foster home from age 12 to whenever you decided to transition out?
So placements are definitely an interesting point of conversation for sure. So I'm just going to make it as simple as possible. So I entered into care. My very first placement was Cretanton of North Carolina. I then went to my first foster home. And by the way, I should say my whole journey of care, I am grateful to say my daughter and I, we were always together. We were never separated, which is a blessing. It's a tremendous blessing.
Huge blessing.
So first placement is Cretanton. Second placement is my first foster mom. And I stayed from 2014 to 2016. So 2 years and some change. And the reason why I had to leave is because she was getting married and her husband, there's this process that the licensures do to vet people to see if a young person or their child can stay in that home. And it takes longer if the person has been a foster parent before in a different state. So that's why we were displaced. We had to leave. And I went to my second foster home with my second foster mom.
And you were about 14 at the time.
I was 16. I was 16 at the time.
Okay.
And I stayed for 9 months. It wasn't the best. I ended up staying at the same school, and my new foster home at the time was literally on the complete opposite side of the city. So it just wasn't the best for me, as well as there was some difficulties of like really truly getting along and just meshing well. So after all the vetting was done, the process was done, I ended up going back to my first foster mom. And I stayed until I believe a month after I graduated high school. And this was in 2018. And this is funny to say. This is funny to say because the last placement that I was in was Crutonton. It was inverted.
Full circle.
Yeah, it was a full circle. And when I went back to Crutonton, I was able to start college. I went to UNC Charlotte. I was able to get my first car. I was able to move into my apartment. And I am proud to say in April of 2019, I was also able to get custody of my daughter. So a lot of stuff happened, especially in the time frame of 2018 when I graduated high school to April of 2019. It was a lot.
It sounds like it. So, what were some of the harder parts of being in foster care, Lanitta? As Mayia had said, contrasting some of the joy and some of the good things, what was hard for you?
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to say, Mayia, thank you so much for articulating that because it's the truth. I mean, there were great things, but there were also some things that I'm still trying to process. I think what we oftentimes fail to realize when a youth is removed and placed into care, how the system is, it almost feels as though it's the youth's fault that they were removed.
Interesting.
And it's not fair. It's not fair, as well as you have adults that make decisions, and sometimes you have adults that are really truly caring. They empathize with you. And then you have other adults that are like, they're a child. They don't know what they want. And it's like, I really wish we can see each other's humanity no matter what. It doesn't matter if you are a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, or a 25-year-old. I think it's really important to see each other's humanity. As well as there was a lot of times where I felt like I was misunderstood, even just being amongst my peers. And when I talk about peers, I'm specifically thinking of people who also experience care. Whenever I was like in community with them, I knew that I felt different just amongst them as well, because I am a parent. I gave birth in the system. And eventually I knew I had to fight with the system to get my child back. So, like I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of times where I had to really, truly prove myself in ways that I felt like was unnecessary, especially when before I aged out. I'm grateful to say that there was a team. I did have a team. My daughter has a team. You know, the famous saying, it takes a village. Well, we had a huge team that I will say the ultimate goal was, okay, let's make sure that Lanitta and her child have everything that they need. So when Lanitta gets older, it's a smooth transition. One of the things that a young person they're supposed to get is a transition living plan. And oftentimes a transition living plan, the social worker or the independent living worker will work with the young person when they're 17, 3 months before they age out. But my links worker was so good. We worked on it when I was 16 because, you know, anything can really happen. And on top of that, when you are a young person and you have a child, it's harder. Okay.
Yes.
It's significantly harder. So when I was 16, I already knew that I was going to college. I already knew what I was going to study. I already knew the different pathways of if I needed assistance. I already knew what I was going to do. Right. But yeah, it was just, there were so many nights that as a young person, I was having an existential crisis, like how I'm going to pay for this, how I'm going to make sure that both me and my child is good. it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. And at times, I just didn't get empathy. At times,
Mm-hmm.
I felt so misunderstood. But
Mm-hmm.
when I aged out, I will say that I was just really determined. I'm glad that even during that time of me being in care, I started doing advocacy. Back in 2014, I started advocating with this organization called Say So, which stands for Strong Able Youth Speaking Out. It was an organization back then. Right now, it's a program under Children's Home Society. And I was able to really share my story and
Mm-hmm.
help inspire so many others to share their story, as well as uplift the importance of young people, the importance of youth voice,
Mm-hmm.
which I am honestly proud of.
Let me pause for a moment to ask, did you know that we are now doing another podcast called Weekend Wisdom? This is a long form. We're interviewing these two wonderful women for an hour, but the Weekend Wisdom podcast is different. We have you submit your questions, and then in 5 to 10 minutes, usually more like 5 minutes, we try to answer the question. So send us your questions. You can send them to info@creatingafamily.org. Send them and we will do our best to answer them. And thank you. I'd like now to shift to a common experience. Well, actually, this is more for Mayia because you experienced sexual abuse. What were some of the long-term impacts that you've experienced from having been abused? In your case, it was by your father.
Yeah, Lanitta did a good job highlighting that sometimes you can feel different amongst other young people who were in care.
Sure.
And for you, Lanitta, it was because of the whole parenting dynamic. For me, it was because of not only the sexual abuse dynamic, not only because of the disability dynamic, but because it happened from my father. And there's a special level of shame
Mm-hmm.
that comes from being sexually abused by a parent that people don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and I just did a video for like my album series talking about, we often give more grace to people when they're like, I got daddy issues, but my mom was the best. Very rarely do people tell the truth about both aspects. I had both. It was different. With my father, was the sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse, psychological. My mom, it was the neglect, physical, like all that. So it was very hard. Like it wasn't until the last few years where I started talking about this foster care period. Because for me, being in foster care meant that I felt weak. And then I got to talk about how I ended up in foster care. And then I got to talk about some of the other details, because if I leave out certain details, then the story falls apart. So like it was like this domino effect of like, if I open up this Pandora's box, am I going to be able to hold it together? And that's a heavy weight to carry that I didn't start letting go of until fairly recently. And the thing that helped me let go, of course, I, talked about my faith, talked about community, but I became an advocate for albinism like in middle school. And at the time, I was still undergoing the kinship care. I hated people. I hated myself. I was no respecter of persons in that regard. And for some reason, God used my indignation for wanting people to understand what comes with having albinism to get me into spoken word and public speaking and advocacy. And then as my other invisible disabilities developed, that carried over with chronic migraine disease, hypermobility spectrum disorder, which is the cousin of Ehlers-Danlos, my vision impairment. So as I'm opening up more and getting comfortable, there comes the call to expand and open up more, right? So to be a young adult now, getting that call yet again, but this time to withhold like that one last piece, one of the few last pieces of my story that has been hidden from the world, and that is my foster care journey. It's an interesting thing. And the thing that motivates me to do it is because I recognize it's not just about me. But I would be lying if I told you that it was easy. I'd be lying if I said that there's still levels, like thank God, from a PTSD perspective, I don't have the nightmares that I used to have, the night sweats that I used to have, the anxiety that I used to have because of it. But there's still a level of Like, oh, if I tell somebody that I was sexually abused, how are they going to view me? And I've gotten to a place in other areas where I don't necessarily care how people view me, but that is it puts you in such a vulnerable position. Like it was years before I felt safe enough to hug men. It was years before I felt safe enough where I wasn't on guard around men. It was years before like I could just allow myself to be embraced, you know? And I think the other aspect of sexual abuse people don't think about is you become overly aware that if I share this aspect of my life story, are people going to identify me by that? Or are they going to identify me by who I actually am?
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine foster care, even if sexual abuse isn't involved, there's still a level I don't think people are aware that you carry around this awareness that if I share, if I am honest, if I am vulnerable, if I'm authentic, are people going to identify me by what I've been through? Are people going to identify me by my scars? Because on one hand, if you're authentic, which I've just learned to over time, thankfully, I have awesome mentors and whatnot, to be authentic regardless of what people think. But when you're in care or you're fresh out of care, like that's all that's on your brain. Especially like you go to doctor's appointments. Like it took me a couple years before I could be fully honest with physicians when they asked if I've ever had any procedures. And outside of the abortion procedure, like, no, I haven't had any procedures. My first gynecologist visit that I established a couple years ago, I had to mentally go into the appointment like, I'm going to have to mention the fact that I had an abortion, I was sexually abused, because that's going to impact her ability to care for me appropriately. Mm-hmm. And that's conversations that people don't anticipate you having to walk through, even as it relates to other areas of life. Because, you know, I tell people, because I'm a mentor and I do public speaking and all that. And I tell people, like, it's a journey, right? It's a journey of navigating your life story. And you can get comfortable in one area. Like for me, I got comfortable talking about albinism and chronic migraine disease and disability. And you don't know what your triggers are sometimes until you run into them. So like you might be comfortable as a young person with a disability or navigating foster care, but then you got to be an adult. How does that impact you?
Yeah. And how does it change how you navigate?
How does it change across your lifespan? I don't necessarily think those conversations are had because it really does impact. Sexual abuse impacts how you see yourself. It impacts how you see the people around you. It impacts your ability to connect your existence to a greater good. For me, that's, you know, my faith in Christ, but like it impacts your ability to even look into the future. I told someone the other day, I said, I'm just now getting to the point where in my mind, I have a future. Because I was so stuck in survival that it literally, like me being 26 years old and doing what I do, like the little me would have never seen that coming because she was too busy trying to survive.
You know, Mayia, one of the things that it's really become a passion of mine because it's so wrong on so many levels. And that is that foster parents and kinship providers as well, but we see it more with foster parents, are often hesitant to take in a child that has experienced sexual abuse. And it's because they are afraid. They are afraid that this child will act out sexually on other children. They're afraid that this child will not heal, that this child is going to have too many issues for them to deal with. And in many ways, we're re-victimizing these kids. It's like the scarlet letter A. We're doing it over and over. And foster parents have a fear. And I try to appreciate and come from that and know that they have this fear. But what would you say to foster parents who are considering a placement, are considering whether to check the box to say for adoption or fostering, whether they think that they would be the best home for a child who has been sexually abused? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I just had a conversation early this morning and we were talking about a lot of the things that we think up here actually inform the lens through which we see life and people and everything that people say and present us with. So, you know, as a Black person, if I just, in my head, I believe everybody is racist, regardless of how compassionate and loving you are, I'm only going to see what you say to me through the lens of the fact that I believe everybody's racist. The same is true with foster care and abuse. If all you believe about sexual abuse is that the people who were victimized are actually the offenders, then you're going to view every child that way, not realizing that that child has been stripped of laws. What are laws? That's love, acceptance, worth, and security. The most precious things that we either learn that we have and hold on to, or we learn that we lack. And when you do that, you are reinforcing cycles of trauma, particularly in certain communities. Sexual abuse can be a prominent thing because kids are unprotected.
Mm-hmm. And that's where you see sexual abuse, is where children are unprotected. Yes.
Where they're unprotected, where there aren't healthy conversations about anatomy, where there aren't healthy conversations around boundaries, like the fact that I don't want to let my child go and have a sleepover. We think that's taboo, but when a lot of things happen outside of our range of view as adults who care for children or people who are parents. Like, we don't have conversations around that. We don't have a healthy perspective of people who make decisions for the safety of their kids. And there's generations ethnically and culturally of that. And so it reinforces that. And one thing I would say to people who are concerned, like, you have an opportunity to break a cycle by protecting a child.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we fully understand the impact of foster. Foster care is just another word for stewardship. Stewardship of another human being that you didn't necessarily bring into this world, but now you have the opportunity to help clarify their paradigm so that they can function and be functional, thriving adults who also yield families and produce outcomes that lead to better communities. Like, if we would stop thinking about tomorrow and recognize that we need to think in terms of generations, we would value the role of foster care a lot differently.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Let me stop here to remind you that we have 12 free online ed courses that are just excellent. They come with, if you need certificates of attendance, if you need CE credit, they come with that. They're 1 hour. They are with wonderful experts and topics that are really relevant to your parenting journey. These courses are brought to you by the Jockey Being Family Foundation. They have been huge supporters of both this podcast, but also creatingafamily.org in general. So check out the free courses at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. You have both, and I'm going to use air quotes here, succeeded despite a lot of obstacles. What do you contribute your success to? And Lanitta, I'll start with you, and we'll end on this because I think it's a powerful way to end.
That's a great question. I would personally say all of the above. So I contribute my success to the happy times, but I also contribute it to the deep, dark times of my life where I had to just sit and think about whether I am worthy of happiness, whether I'm worthy of my dreams coming true. And me personally, I got to a point where I'm like, I do have choices. I can sit here with my trauma. I can sit here with my anger, with my frustration, or I can use it to build what I'm saying internally for me is my own mini empire, right?
I like that.
Right. There's that choice. And what I like to always have in the back of my head is I always remember where I came from. I always remember the times where I felt frustrated with myself, felt frustrated with just simply being in care. And then there were always times where I had my child. And one of the things that I told my mentor at the time, literally, I just gave birth to my baby girl. And I was just really vulnerable. And I said, how can I raise a little one when I don't even have my mom? I don't even know what it means to really do these things. And it was just the sheer moment of my mentor holding my hand and told me I'm not alone, right? So I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the people who invested in me and showed me that I can invest in myself.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I appreciate it all. Like, I realize that this is a journey. There's going to be ups and downs. And I'm fine with that. And I'm really happy that I can utilize my story to really create change, to inspire people. And that in itself is rewarding for me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
even if I didn't do anything else in life, it's just the fact that I can sit back and see people that I mentor, see my mentors, and just be grateful that I was able to do something that will outlive me.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so beautiful. It's so
Yeah,
beautiful.
absolutely. Mayia, what do you attribute your success to?
Without a doubt, my faith in Christ. Because when I was lonely, crying myself in a closet after being abused, he was there. When I didn't have anyone to reach out to, he was there. When I started developing relationships, and I also have like 5 mentors, like that kind of became an extension of that. And for me, I think success, there's a African proverb. If you want to go, somewhere, you can try to do it by yourself. But if you want to go far, like that's where community comes in. And so for me, it's faith, it's community. And then pragmatically speaking, a lesson that I've had to learn is like being malleable, where you're able to deal with the hard things and recognize like it's a journey. And there are times where my experience with trauma and foster care really took a hit to my worth, how I see myself, how I can add value. Even like a couple of years ago when I was coming up with my consulting prices, like I needed help because it was such a paradigm shift for me to think that I could add value in a monetary sense because this is something I'm passionate about that is also worthy of being compensated for. I had to unpack layers of that too, and recognizing like, oh, that came from that.
Interesting.
So surrounding yourself in community with people who can reflect to you the real image of who you are and not what your trauma is trying to reflect to you. Because if you allow the reflection of your trauma to be the only thing that you see and the only lens through which you view yourself, you will allow yourself to disqualify yourself from sharing your story. You will allow yourself to disqualify yourself from living. You will allow yourself to essentially undo a lot of the work that you've done internally. You will disqualify yourself from relationships, opportunities. So learning to tether yourself to something that's bigger than you in community, those are the things that have really helped me be nurtured in terms of success.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Mayia Warren and Lanitta Berry. We're going to go out by listening to a new album by Mayia Warren. The album is Becoming Mayia. This is track 2. We're picking it up kind of in the middle of track 2. And I love the title, Better Not Bitter.
I'm giving way to your construction, cause one thing I know I want to be. I wanna be better. I don't wanna be bitter. So I'm letting go now. I'm starting to see clearer.
Mayia, before we leave, where can people get your album?
So people can support me directly on even.biz. It's a platform that allows you to buy artist album directly. Streaming platforms take a large portion. And you can also find it on streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, Amazon Music. So those are some of the ways you can support. And it'll soon be up on my website at mayawarren.org, which is MAYIAWARREN.org.
Thank you. And thank you both for being with us today. Did you know that Hopscotch Adoptions have been a long-term, and I do mean a long-term supporter of creating a family and our mission and this podcast? Hopscotch Adoptions is a Hague-accredited international adoption agency placing children from Armenia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Georgia, Ghana, Guyana, Morocco, Pakistan, Serbia, and Ukraine. They specialize in the placement of children with Down syndrome and other special needs. They also do a lot of kinship adoptions. They place kids throughout the U.S. and offer home study services and post-adoption services to residents of North Carolina and New York.